The Titanic was supposed to usher in a new era for marine travel. Up until this point, many people feared that taking a cruise or venturing to another country would be far too dangerous, as the likelihood that a ship may sink along the way was relatively high. However, when the Titanic came along, it was touted as being unsinkable. Many people felt that this meant the days of perishing at sea had finally come to an end. Because of this, more than 2,200 people boarded the Titanic, leaving Europe and heading toward North America. Some of these people were simply traveling to visit loved ones, while others were venturing to America to start new lives. The idea of an unsinkable ship was incredibly fascinating to many people. Thus, everyone wanted to take part in the maiden voyage of the Titanic. Little did they know that on that fateful day in 1912, more than half of the people who boarded the ship would not make it home alive. We've all heard the many stories surrounding the sinking of the Titanic. One of the most famous is in regards to the 8-piece band that played religious hymns until the ship's bitter end, when they placed their instruments back in their carrying cases and awaited their fate. In addition to remarkable stories like this one, today we'd like to introduce you to 15 scary events from the Titanic that will give you chills. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit that like button and ring the notification bell for more videos. Astounding parallels. This first story has got to be one of the most bizarre, but it's completely true. About 14 years before the Titanic would meet its end, Morgan Robertson would release a novel titled Titan. The parallels between this novel and what would eventually come to pass with the Titanic are uncanny. Robertson's novel describes a very large ship named Titan that eventually collides with an iceberg. Immediately afterward, nearly all of the passengers lost their lives at sea. Just like the Titanic, the Titan was also carrying far fewer lifeboats than it should have, meaning that in the event of an emergency, people were guaranteed to lose their lives. Because of the similarities between the two stories, many people began to claim that Morgan Robertson had special abilities that allowed him to see the future. However, he's always denied these claims. The Priest. As the Titanic had slowly begun to sink into the ocean, it became clear to many people on board the ship that they were never going to make it home. It was around this time that the lifeboats were being filled with passengers, with the famous phrase, "women and children first," echoing through the hulls of the ship. A priest had been on the ship that day, and he was offered a spot on one of the boats. However, he decided to sacrifice his own life so that someone else could board the lifeboats. He stayed behind and waited for the ship to sink, spending his time with the remaining passengers on board. He spoke with many of them and did his best to calm their fears in the moments leading up to their demise. He quoted scripture as the ship sank and eventually became one of the 1,500 people who did not survive. The first film. I'm sure most of us have either seen or heard of the film Titanic that starred Leonardo DiCaprio and many others. The film was considered to be a cinematic masterpiece and has lived on as one of the greatest films ever made. For most people, this may have been the first and only Titanic film they'd ever seen. However, a far less popular film was released just 29 days after the Titanic sank. The film was titled Saved from the Titanic and starred Dorothy Gibson. Dorothy had been on the Titanic just 4 weeks earlier, and she jumped at the chance to star in the film and tell her story. Filmmakers created the film in record time and released it while the ship was still fresh on the minds of everyone involved. Many people saw this as an immoral cash-in on the deaths of hundreds of people, but others felt that it paid homage to the people who lost their lives far too soon. The helplessness of the captain. A photo of Captain Edward John Smith was taken before the ship set sail, showing the captain filled with both pride and elegance as he prepared to lead his crew and passengers to New York. The British man was chosen to lead the ship as he had many years of experience, and captaining a ship like this would have been no difficult task for him. He had previously worked with White Star Line on ships such as the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. Edward John Smith was considered to be a very strict yet sincere person. He, however, was unable to save the ship from its certain demise and went down with the ship in the middle of the ocean. A true captain never leaves his crew or ship behind, and it's safe to say that Captain Edward John Smith earned his place in maritime history on that fateful day. Whiskey as a lifesaver. Charles Jockin was the head baker on the Titanic. He had been in the kitchen the evening of the impact and was one of just a few people who managed to survive the sinking of the ship. On an almost miraculous occasion, the man managed to survive for more than 2 hours in the icy waters that evening and lived to tell the tale. When asked how he managed to do such a thing, Charles explained that he continued paddling throughout the evening to keep his body temperature up. He claims that this is what saved his life. However, rescuers would soon also learn that he had drunk a bottle of whiskey before the crash as well. This whiskey helped to keep his blood from freezing and kept him alive in the icy conditions until he could be rescued. Puzzling lifeboat. About a month after the incident, the crew of the RMS Oceanic would make a startling discovery as they were out at sea one evening. Just in the distance, a member of the crew spotted what appeared to be a small boat sailing across the open waters. As they continued to approach the boat, they began to realize that this boat was no ordinary vessel. It was a life raft from the Titanic that had sunk almost 30 days prior. The discovery of the life raft would send the world into a frenzy once again, with speculations about what could have happened to the passengers on board that would have caused them to float so far off course. According to crew members who discovered the raft, the boat had been floating more than 200 miles off its original path, though speculation continued to rise when the crew discovered that 3 people were still inside the boat, all of whom had perished several weeks before. Imagine being able to leave the Titanic, the world's largest sinking ship. The amount of relief these people must have felt is unimaginable, though they were still doomed to suffer a fate while out at sea. Though now their suffering would be prolonged as they floated adrift for nearly 4 weeks. It's terrible what happened to these people, but we must remember their suffering and their lives so that as time marches on, we can prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Moving love for animals. These days, having a deep love for animals and pets isn't uncommon. However, back in the early 1900s, it may have seemed insane for someone to give up their place on a lifeboat in exchange for staying with their dog on the sinking ship. However, that is exactly what Anne Elizabeth Isham did. When she was offered a place on a lifeboat, she was told that her Great Dane would have to stay behind. Instead of leaving her dog, Anne opted to stay behind with her Great Dane and waited out until the bitter end. After the ship sank, her body was eventually recovered from the frozen waters. When rescuers pulled her aboard, her body was still wrapped around the body of her beloved dog. The Melody of Death. As the ship was beginning to sink, many of the passengers were beginning to panic, as certain death was lingering only a few moments away. A team of 8 musicians did everything within their power to calm the passengers and decided to serenade them as the ship slowly sank to the depths. Their music helped calm the minds and hearts of the children and adults on board and made their final moments a little bit easier. According to eyewitnesses who managed to survive the crash, the final songs to be played by the Titanic's band were Nearer, My God, to Thee and Autumn. Downfall of a Gentleman. Benjamin Guggenheim was a very wealthy man who was on the Titanic. While he had achieved much success in his life, he accepted his fate as calmly as someone could. According to witnesses from that fateful evening, he and his butler dressed in their finest evening attire and patiently waited for the ship to go down. According to those who were nearby that evening, it's been said that he calmly turned to one of the crew members and said, "We are appropriately dressed and ready to go down like gentlemen." Moments later, the ship would sink, and his body would never be recovered. Love to the end. Ida Strauss was met with a dilemma when her husband wasn't allowed to get on board one of the lifeboats with her. For most of the women that evening, they decided to board the boats without their spouses. However, Ida refused. Instead, she stayed behind with her husband, and they waited it out together. In the end, Ida gave up her place in exchange for her maid, Ellen. When the maid boarded the lifeboat, Ida gave her a fur coat and said to keep it because she wouldn't need it anymore. This coat is likely what saved the maid's life. According to witnesses, both Ida and her husband then returned to their cabin and waited for the end. The ignored warnings. There have been many rumors spread throughout the years that the crew of the Titanic didn't see the iceberg and had no idea that they were heading straight for it. However, this is untrue. In fact, there have been reports that claim that no less than 6 warnings were issued to the crew through their communication system, warning them that they were approaching an iceberg. All of these warnings went unnoticed for one reason or another, and the ship eventually met its end due to sheer negligence. The icy grave. This may be shocking to learn, but did you know that most of the people who lost their lives in the crash did not pass away due to drowning? As it would turn out, the water that evening was estimated to be around -2 degrees Celsius. This meant that many of the people on the ship that evening who knew how to swim would have likely begun to do so after the ship fell beneath the surface of the ocean. However, even so, after no more than 15 minutes, their blood would have begun to freeze and they would have lost their lives. According to some experts, this amount of time may have been as low as 2 minutes. John Jacob Astor. The Titanic would have been filled with hundreds of incredibly wealthy people, though the most financially successful man on board would be John Jacob Astor IV. Sadly, even his fame and fortune could not save him from his terrible fate, as John was crushed by a chimney when the ship began to sink. At the time, he was worth an estimated $1.6 billion when adjusted for inflation. John was so badly injured that he could only be identified by his platinum ring and the $4,000 he kept in his pocket, worth almost $100,000 in today's money. Burials at sea. Contrary to reports that came out at the time, it's been said that many of the people who lost their lives in the Titanic disaster did not get the dignified burials that the media claimed. According to a photo found in 2013, it's been said that there were so many bodies floating in the water the following day that the rescue ships simply couldn't handle them all. Instead of retrieving the bodies, they simply piled them into sacks. A priest blessed them all at once, then the sacks were tossed back into the ocean. Only 337 bodies were officially brought home. The victims. According to various reports, it's estimated that more than 75% of the third-class passengers lost their lives because they were simply not allowed to board the lifeboats. 80% of the deaths that day were males. To make matters worse, there were 109 children aboard the ship that day, but only 27 survived. This is truly one of the most chilling facts about the Titanic's fateful demise. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like button and ring the notification bell for more videos.